In the aftermath of World War II, the world stood at a crossroads. The Axis powers had been defeated, but a new ideological struggle was emerging, one that would shape global politics for decades to come: the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, wartime allies turned adversaries, now stood on opposite sides of a widening ideological chasm: capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism. The Korean peninsula, long a pawn in the struggles of empires, was about to become the first major battleground of this new world order. For centuries, Korea had been a unified nation with a rich cultural heritage. But after Japan's defeat in 1945, the victorious Allies divided the peninsula along the 38th parallel as a temporary administrative measure. The Soviet Union occupied the north, while the United States oversaw the south. This arbitrary division, meant to be temporary, hardened into permanence as Cold War tensions escalated. Two governments emerged: the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north under Kim Il-sung, and the Capitalist Republic of Korea in the south, led by Syngman Rhee. Neither side accepted the division as legitimate. Both claimed sovereignty over the entire peninsula, and both prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The United States, still basking in its victory in World War II and eager to contain the spread of communism, maintained a limited presence in South Korea, but believed the young nation could stand on its own. Meanwhile, Stalin and Mao Zedong supported Kim Il-sung's vision of reunification under communism, supplying weapons, training, and political backing. On June 25, 1950, that fragile peace shattered. In the early hours of the morning, North Korean troops poured across the 38th parallel, launching a full-scale invasion of the south. Soviet-built T-34 tanks spearheaded the assault, overwhelming South Korean defenses. Within days, the capital, Seoul, fell. The world watched in shock as the first major conflict of the Cold War exploded into open war. For President Harry S. Truman, the stakes were far larger than the Korean peninsula. If communist aggression went unchecked here, where would it stop? The Truman Doctrine, announced just 3 years earlier, had pledged U.S. support to nations resisting communism. Now that doctrine was being tested. If we let Korea down, Truman declared, the Soviets will keep right on going and swallow up one place after another. The United States acted swiftly. Within days, Truman ordered American air and naval forces to support South Korea. On June 27th, the United Nations Security Council, boycotted by the Soviet Union at the time, passed a resolution calling for member states to assist South Korea. It was a rare moment of global unity. Under the UN banner, but in reality led by the United States, a multinational coalition was formed. American troops, many of them veterans of World War II, began arriving in Korea within weeks. Yet despite US intervention, the situation deteriorated rapidly. North Korean forces advanced relentlessly, pushing South Korean and UN troops southward. By August, the defenders were cornered in a small area around Pusan, the last major port in the southeast. The Pusan perimeter became the final line of defense, a desperate stand against annihilation. American soldiers, hastily deployed and often ill-prepared, fought with remarkable tenacity. It was here that the first great test of the Cold War unfolded. The fate of South Korea, and perhaps the credibility of American foreign policy itself, hung in the balance. In the summer of 1950, the situation in Korea was dire. The North Korean People's Army, disciplined and battle-hardened, seemed unstoppable. American and South Korean forces clung to the Pusan perimeter, launching desperate counterattacks to buy time for reinforcements and supplies. The casualty lists grew longer by the day, and morale wavered. The world watched anxiously. Would the United States, the great victor of World War II, suffer defeat in its first major Cold War test? Into this moment of crisis stepped General Douglas MacArthur, one of the most celebrated and controversial American commanders of the 20th century. As the Supreme Commander of UN forces, MacArthur was tasked with reversing the tide of war. Bold, charismatic, and deeply self-assured, he devised a plan as daring as it was risky: an amphibious landing far behind enemy lines at the port city of Inchon. Military planners were skeptical. Inchon's tides were treacherous, its approaches narrow, and its defenses formidable. Success seemed improbable, but MacArthur was adamant. "We shall land at Inchon," he declared, "and I shall crush them." On September 15, 1950, Operation Chromite commenced. As dawn broke, waves of American Marines stormed the beaches, catching the North Koreans completely off guard. Within days, Inchon was secured, and UN forces surged inland toward Seoul. The Inchon landing was a masterstroke, one of the most brilliant amphibious operations in military history. It transformed the course of the war almost overnight. Cut off from their supply lines, North Korean forces collapsed. Seoul was recaptured by September 28th, and the once unstoppable enemy began a chaotic retreat northward. What had seemed a looming defeat now looked like a stunning reversal. Flush with success, American and UN commanders faced a pivotal decision. Should they stop at the 38th parallel and restore the pre-war boundary, or press on into North Korea and attempt reunification under a democratic government? For Truman and MacArthur, the answer was clear. This was not merely about defending South Korea, it was about rolling back communism itself. Confident that China would not intervene, MacArthur pushed north toward the Yalu River, the border with Manchuria. In October, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel. Pyongyang fell swiftly, and victory seemed within reach. Newspapers at home proclaimed the war nearly over. Truman even began reducing the military draft. But beneath the surface, storm clouds were gathering. In Beijing, Mao Zedong watched with growing alarm as American troops approached China's frontier. He had warned repeatedly that Chinese forces would intervene if UN troops came too close. His warnings were dismissed. By late October, the first Chinese units and the so-called People's Volunteers slipped across the Yalu under cover of darkness. At first, their presence went unnoticed. Then, on October 25th, they struck with sudden ferocity, ambushing UN units and then vanishing into the mountains. It was a warning shot, one that MacArthur ignored. He ordered his forces to continue their advance. In November, the Chinese struck again, this time in overwhelming numbers. Hundreds of thousands of troops poured into Korea, catching the UN coalition completely off guard. The result was catastrophic. In freezing conditions, amid rugged terrain and collapsing supply lines, UN forces were thrown into one of the most desperate retreats in modern military history. Cities like Pyongyang were abandoned. Seoul, liberated just weeks earlier, was lost once more. The Korean War had entered a new brutal phase, one that would test the resolve of the United States and redefine the balance of power in Asia. By early 1951, the euphoria of Inchon had vanished, replaced by grim determination. The arrival of Chinese forces had transformed the Korean War from a regional conflict into a brutal proxy war between superpowers. The front lines surged back and forth as both sides launched offensives and counteroffensives across a shattered landscape. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, villages were leveled, civilians fled by the millions. The human cost was staggering and rising. In January, Seoul fell again to communist forces. Panic rippled through Washington. Had the United States overreached? Was the Korean venture doomed? President Truman, under immense pressure, considered drastic options, even the use of atomic weapons. MacArthur, ever the hawk, urged escalation, calling for airstrikes on Chinese bases and a wider war against Beijing itself. But Truman, wary of igniting World War III, refused. He sought a limited war, one that contained communism without triggering a global catastrophe. The clash between the two men became a constitutional crisis. MacArthur, frustrated by what he saw as political interference, publicly criticized the president's strategy. Truman, determined to assert civilian control over the military, made a fateful decision. On April 11, 1951, he relieved MacArthur of his command. The dismissal shocked the nation. MacArthur returned to a hero's welcome in the United States, but Truman stood firm. "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president," he said. "I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was." With MacArthur gone, General Matthew Ridgway took command. Under his leadership, UN forces regrouped and launched a series of successful counterattacks. By March 1951, Seoul was retaken. for the fourth and final time. The front stabilized near the 38th parallel, almost exactly where the war had begun. What followed was a grueling 2-year stalemate, a brutal war of attrition fought over hills, ridges and valleys, whose names, Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, Porkchop Hill, became synonymous with sacrifice. Conditions on the ground were hellish. Soldiers endured searing summers and bitter winters in trenches, reminiscent of World War I. Artillery thundered day and night. Patrols clashed in deadly close-quarters combat. Gains were measured in yards, often at staggering cost. American troops fought alongside allies from Britain, Canada, Turkey, Australia, and other nations, forging bonds of brotherhood amid the chaos. Diplomatic efforts to end the conflict began in July 1951, but progress was painfully slow. The central issue was the fate of prisoners of war. Many captured North Korean and Chinese soldiers refused repatriation, fearing execution if returned home. The communist side demanded their forcible return. The UN insisted on voluntary repatriation. Negotiations dragged on for 2 years, even as the killing continued. At home, the Korean War tested America's patience and resolve. Unlike World War II, it was never formally declared by Congress. It was dubbed a police action, a euphemism that belied its ferocity. Over time, public enthusiasm waned. The war was not yielding decisive victories, nor was it clearly explained. Newspapers called it the Forgotten War, overshadowed by World War II before it and the looming Cold War crises after it. Yet for the men fighting and dying in Korea, it was anything but forgotten. By 1952, the war had become a central issue in American politics. President Truman, deeply unpopular, chose not to seek re-election. His successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a World War II hero, campaigned on a promise to end the conflict. "I shall go to Korea," he declared, and he did, visiting the front lines in December 1952. His presence signaled a new determination to bring the war to a close. When Dwight Eisenhower took office in January 1953, the Korean War had raged for nearly 3 years, with no end in sight. Both sides were exhausted. The United States had suffered over 36,000 dead and more than 100,000 wounded. Chinese and North Korean casualties were exponentially higher, as were those of Korean civilians. Entire cities lay in ruins. Yet the front lines remained stubbornly close to where they had been in 1950. Eisenhower recognized that a decisive military victory was unlikely without widening the war, a step he was unwilling to take. Instead, he pursued a strategy of pressure and diplomacy. He hinted at the possibility of escalating the conflict, including the potential use of nuclear weapons, while simultaneously signaling a willingness to negotiate. Stalin's death in March 1953 further shifted the balance as the Soviet Union's new leadership sought to reduce Cold War tensions. Negotiators in Panmunjom, where talks had been stalled for months, made renewed progress. The prisoner of war issue was resolved with a compromise. Those who wished to return could do so, while others could choose resettlement in neutral countries. Finally, after 2 years of grueling diplomacy and battlefield stalemate, an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. The terms of the armistice restored the boundary near the 38th parallel, creating a demilitarized zone, DMZ, roughly 2.5 miles wide, a buffer that remains one of the most fortified borders on Earth. A ceasefire was declared, but no peace treaty was ever signed. Technically, the Korean War never ended. It is to this day a frozen conflict. For the United States, the Korean War marked a turning point. It was the first major military test of the Cold War, and it shaped U.S. foreign policy for decades. It demonstrated America's willingness to use force to contain communism, a principle that would later guide interventions in Vietnam, Latin America, and beyond. It also transformed the U.S. military, leading to permanent overseas deployments, expanded defense budgets, and a deeper integration with allies under the umbrella of collective security. The war left an indelible mark on the Korean peninsula. More than 3 million Koreans, soldiers and civilians, perished. Families were torn apart, villages obliterated, and a nation divided. In the South, decades of authoritarian rule eventually gave way to a vibrant democracy, and one of the world's most advanced economies. In the north, a totalitarian regime hardened into a hereditary dictatorship, isolated and hostile, yet enduring. The DMZ remains a stark reminder of the unresolved conflict, a scar across the land, dividing families and ideologies alike. For American veterans, the Korean War was a deeply personal chapter, one marked by valor, sacrifice, and endurance. They fought in brutal conditions against overwhelming odds, often with little recognition. Many returned to a country eager to forget, overshadowed by the triumph of World War II and the turmoil of Vietnam. Yet their contribution was profound. They preserved the independence of South Korea, upheld the credibility of American commitments, and demonstrated the resolve of a nation determined to stand against tyranny. Today, more than 70 years later, the Korean War remains a paradox, a war that ended where it began, a war without victory, yet without defeat. It was a conflict fought in the shadows of a new era, setting the stage for the geopolitical struggles of the second half of the 20th century. Its legacy endures not only in the divided peninsula it left behind, but also in the lessons it taught about power, ideology, and the price of freedom. It taught that wars fought for principles can be ambiguous, that victories are not always defined by conquered territory, and that the defense of liberty often demands sacrifice without glory. It showed that the Cold War was not merely a contest of words and threats, but a deadly struggle fought by ordinary men in frozen trenches and foreign lands. Above all, the Korean War revealed something enduring about the American character. Faced with aggression and uncertainty, the United States did not retreat. It answered the call, not for conquest, but for defense, not to expand its empire, but to uphold its ideals. And though history may have tried to forget the Korean War, the men who fought it, and the cause for which they fought, remain etched in the story of freedom's defense. The Korean War may be called the Forgotten War, but its echoes still shape our world. The DMZ still stands, a silent witness to unresolved history. American troops still serve on Korean soil, guardians of a fragile peace. And the alliance forged in the crucible of that conflict endures as one of the strongest in the world. The war may have ended without fanfare, but its lessons endure, reminders of the cost of freedom, the complexity of justice, and the enduring struggle to secure both.